Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Climate of Sport podcast with me, Claire Poole. It is a pleasure to be back with you. And of course, in case you've been living under a rock, the Men's World Cup 2026 starts today. Your feeds have probably been absolutely full of it, as have ours. We're going to get straight into the climate hat trick this week. And of course, we have to start with the FIFA Men's World Cup 2026. So headlines are full in the mainstream press of ticket news. Many seats apparently remain unsold. What has been publicised as the most inclusive World Cup has hit the headlines because of the Somali referee who has not been allowed into the country, was turned back at Miami, even though he's a highly decorated referee. Some reports of why he wasn't then given a job to referee in perhaps Mexico or Canada. Of course, these things are probably planned very far in advance, and shifting things around could be problematic, but a great query. Loads of social media coverage about how players have arrived into the United States to be greeted by checks from the immigration and security checks, etc. Meanwhile, images of players arriving in Mexico greeted by mariachi bands, and lots of excitement there. So different approaches, and it's going to be a very busy 6 weeks. Eventually, we'll start looking at the football as well, starting today, but there's a huge amount of coverage on the front pages as well as the back about the World Cup. So, of course, what we're interested in is the environmental stories and what's happening so far. So there's been a few, in case you've missed them, that we'll just highlight. The first one last week, at the end of last week, was Robert Weiland's Ocean Life, also known as the Wailing Wall 82, is an environmental mural in downtown Dallas. It's been a landmark there since 1999, an image of whales and the ocean to promote ocean conservation. And it's been a part of the city's visual identity for, 27 years, so nearly 30 years. It's been visible there. People started to notice that it was being painted over to make way for a World Cup mural. And now, since this announcement, the artist is suing FIFA and its local partners in Dallas for, quote, hastily and irrevocably destroying a civic landmark. The big question with this one is why they didn't just choose a different wall to paint over. It's not exactly a good look, I think, in terms of such a famous and visual landmark promoting ocean conservation to be painted over. It is a very visible part of downtown Dallas, and they're saying that's why it was chosen, but I'm sure there were plenty of other blank walls. And that, in line with the next story, is also, there's a bit of irony going on. So whilst ocean conservation visual identity mark is being painted over, there has been now a lot of news around plastic bottles, which obviously we know plastic is one of the biggest polluters of our oceans. And we have a separate story on that. So last week, ticket holders for the FIFA Men's World Cup received an email saying they were no longer allowed to bring reusable bottles into stadium. Previously, in the terms and conditions, it had been the case that that was allowed. So 7 days before the tournament, the announcement was made that this was no longer the case. So this policy U-turn was cited for safety reasons and was then widely criticised through a number of different lenses. One, the fact that we are expecting a very, very hot tournament. So the hydration, people bringing in their own receptacles, means that hydration is going to be more accessible for people to refill. So obviously by not allowing that in, essentially FIFA is pushing people towards purchasing hydration at a very expensive World Cup already. People may choose not to do that, and then you start looking at dehydration issues. So the human health aspect was a big one. Of course, the costs as well. This is a tournament that has had a lot of coverage around the costs, from tickets to travel between games to hotels and accommodation. A lot of the conversation around this tournament has been around cost. So this felt like it was adding another cost in by not allowing people to bring in their reusables to stadium. And of course, from our perspective, a huge amount of more waste would be generated by this move. So FIFA have then, since this announcement, U-turned on that. So they've kind of done a 360, but with some limitations. So first of all, they've said for venues in the US and Canada, not in Mexico, or Mexico has not been mentioned yet, one soft plastic 20-ounce factory sealed disposable water bottle is allowed in. Safety, of course, is paramount. And hard reusable, let's say, could be used for missiles on the pitch. It's not unusual for major tournaments to not allow hard bottles into stadia. But the optics of this obviously are difficult. They're encouraging the public essentially to use single-use plastic. In their sustainability strategy, they obviously have a whole section for circularity and resource for host cities to adhere to and to promote. And this is seemingly contrary to that. They are essentially showing the chief operations officer of the FIFA Men's World Cup 2026 in an Instagram post holding up a single-use bottle and promoting that as what fans should be using, which around the general discourse of what we're trying to do in sporting events feels a bit counterintuitive. So no mention of Mexico, which is one of the venues that we expect to be impacted by extreme heat, perhaps more so than others in different parts of the continental United States and Canada. And also, we've seen pushback from charities like Oceana that have called on FIFA to reverse this decision and urgently equip stadiums with free water stations and reusable cups. So we'll see what happens, but I'd imagine with the World Cup starting today, this is where we've landed, and this is probably where we're going to be with that. So that's another environmental story to keep an eye on. And then the last one, although there are quite a few, the last one I'll talk about is the grass pitches for the World Cup that have come under scrutiny. So on a mainstream level, if you look at what football fans more generally are talking about, they're talking about the quality of the grass pitches, how the balls bounce, the potential for injury, etc. And the fact that these, by social media influencers and others, are saying the quality of the pitch is not good enough for the standard of football and the players. We have been highlighting the fact that, of course, these pitches aren't going to play like they do perhaps in Europe or other parts of the world where stadiums have grass pitches year round, and they are tended to by groundskeepers and they are supported, on a long-term basis. And the stadium is essentially set up for that. A lot of these pitches are NFL pitches that have AstroTurf, and they are having this system laid on top of it. So, of course, they're not going to play exactly the same. But there's a lot to unpack in lots of different ways, but what I want to focus on is the environmental perspective, because this is a bit of an underreported story, because the grass that you're seeing and you'll see at the World Cup in terms of the matches being played, especially in the US, have had the grass grown in some instances thousands of kilometers away from the stadium. It's been transported there on the back of refrigerated vehicles, and there are different grass blends being used. So Bermuda grass in hotter southern cities, ryegrass and Kentucky bluegrass, mixtures in cooler northern cities, and then obviously for the most part that's hybrid reinforced systems to help support heat toleration and heavy use and reduced water consumption as far as possible. All the pitches are being laid on drainage, there's engineered sand bases, there's irrigation, etc. in there. So the technical specification is high, and obviously agronomists and experts have been working on this for years. Many stadiums, especially Atlanta, Houston, and Dallas, are indoor arenas, so we're going to see massive grow light systems on those as well to maintain the grass pitches across the tournament. And we've read that there are backup grass being grown as well in case parts of the stadia pitches need to be replaced during the tournament. The grass obviously is unlikely to be good for anything at the end of the tournament with the heavy use and trying to keep it going. This is interesting. There is obviously quite a large environmental impact of the grass stadiums that are being used. It in no way equates to the likes of Qatar 2022, where many new stadiums were built. The construction of a new stadium, obviously, with a vast carbon and environmental footprint, and this not anywhere near that. But it's not insignificant either in terms of the environmental cost, and it's been pretty overlooked compared to other stories like travel. So every week, the Climate of Sport across the FIFA Men's World Cup 2026 will bring you the latest environmental stories. So if you or colleagues are interested, keep following, and also send the podcast to other people to keep updated as well. We're seeing growth with the podcast, which is brilliant, and loads of feedback, and we want to keep growing it and getting the environmental messages in sport out further. Okay, the second story of the Climate Hat Trick this week is I might be a mutant now, sport in polluted waters. The climate crisis we know is affecting sports environments, and it's something we talk about a lot. So we talk, say, about extreme heat, say, at affecting tournaments during play. We talk about postponed or cancelled tournaments because of flooding or of hurricanes. So we often talk about the acute impact of the climate crisis on sport. What we tend not to talk about as much is the kind of chronic impact of the climate crisis on sport, how extreme weather events and their aftermath are impacting athletes' training long term. And the University of Waikato in New Zealand have put this right with recent research suggesting impacts aren't just temporary inconveniences immediately after extreme weather events, but they're becoming part of the new sporting normal. So months after Cyclone Gabrielle, athletes in New Zealand were still contending with contaminated waterways, sewage pollution, and flood debris. The project and the research involved focus groups of 45 athletes between the ages of 13 to 25 in the Te Rāwhiti area, which is a range of sports including surfing, kayaking, rowing, rugby, swimming, and skateboarding. And this resulting research introduces the concept of polluted sport, which describes how athletes are being forced to navigate contaminated and damaged environments caused by the climate crisis and extreme weather events whilst continuing to train and compete. So examples given in this research are surfers having to dodge really big floating logs while they train, rowers going through water that, in their words, smelled like vomit, and then kayaking from those in rivers that say, quote, it smells like poo. One young male rower said, I might be a mutant now, referring to repeated exposure in floodwater and contaminated silt. And a young Waka Ama paddler said, the awa, which is the word for river in Maori, is kind of part of us, but you don't want to paddle in a river that's just full of sewage, sticking out branches, really big logs, and dead animals. It's so gross. Some have adapted with improvised safety measures. So an example given is a young surfer training and having a parent stand on the beach to point out giant logs to avoid as they train. Unfortunately, others have just given up, which is terrible news for the future of sport, because young athletes in the study have focused on nationals and world championships and ongoing environmental damage and disruption, making it really hard to achieve their goals. This study is a really interesting one. We'll put the link in the show notes to look at, to read into, and to refer to in this area that we don't often highlight. And it offers a vivid glimpse of the climate crisis's long tail. So it's not just damaged infrastructure and disrupted tournaments and events, but altered everyday experiences, including where and how young people train on their path to being contenders in major sport. Okay, our last story on the climate hat trick this week is from SW19 to 10065, which is the zip code for Central Park and the Woolman Rink. Wimbledon is heading to Central Park. So Wimbledon's decision to transform Central Park's Woolman Rink into a temporary grass court venue is marking the next stage of its US strategy. They've been for 4 years in the Brooklyn Bridge Park, and they've exported the very famous, if you want to call it Henman Hill, if you want to call it Murray Mound, they transported that to Brooklyn through the Hill, which is the All England club, giving the experience to people in the US. And they're now moving this experience to Central Park for a 4-day experience with a playable grass court, legends matches, fan clinics, and live screenings. This is a really interesting story, not just from a sport business perspective, but obviously there are environmental considerations as well. This move is reflecting a broader shift in sport business, where brands are increasingly traveling to fans instead of the other way round. There are a few different angles for us to think about when it comes to this. Let's start with the really obvious one, the environmental impact and emissions. So distributed fandom, of course, does not equate to decarbonised sport. Wimbledon is still taking place this year in SW19, and this is happening in addition, as it has done in Brooklyn for the past 4 years. So the footprint of the wider tournament is going to increase, as are the emissions. They're putting grass courts in place, which obviously are going to have to be put in place. They're going to have to be irrigated. They're going to have to be taken care of. They're going to have a whole event area set up in terms of the matches, the clinics, and the viewings as well. There's going to be giant screens. There's going to be a big event infrastructure. So, of course, there are going to be emissions and impacts from that. However, major tournaments often attract thousands of travelling fans without tickets. So we see these atmosphere fans often at major tournaments that travel to cities just to take in the atmosphere and be part of it, even when they don't have tickets. So this is an interesting example of where the sport business can reach higher numbers without the international travel. The World Cup's about to start. Going back and referencing the World Cup, fan festivals are also taking place in all of the cities. And it's a model that's existed since the early aughts. And it has become a major part of sporting tournaments. It's difficult to find exact figures on how many people travel and what they achieve. But when it comes to, say, for example, football mega events, fan zones, and public viewing areas, we know routinely attract higher numbers of non-ticketed spectators and large crowds, which obviously have an environmental footprint, especially if they're traveling. We've seen cases in Europe, traveling across Europe to get involved with this. And academic studies describe them as events within events that draw both ticketed and non-ticketed fans, mean a significant share of event-related travel is decoupled with match attendance itself. So this idea of having something like the Wimbledon in Central Park, there's a question of, is it going to reduce international travel? Probably not. People who have the means and the desire to go to Wimbledon at SW19 in London are probably going to do that anyway. But this offers an opportunity for people to experience it in New York, which may not necessarily mean a reduced impact in Wimbledon, but also in terms of unending growth. And we see a lot of stadium infrastructure. We see a lot of sports organizations looking for growth, and there are emissions increases because of that. This is the start of an exploration of what the future of sport might look like and what the model looks like and how the environmental impact comes in. Another area is the globalization of sports. This is a reminder that the environmental impact of that globalization, in terms of the idea that a sporting event that's synonymous with one region is popping up in others. So we've seen this with Premier League matches in Australia, NBA games in Paris and the United Arab Emirates, Major League Baseball games in London. This model is growing in popularity. And of course, that has an environmental footprint as well. However, this is a model we're starting to see. Sports growth continues, and how can we decouple that growth from infrastructure? This is an idea that goes in line with that. So, as we've said, New York isn't going to replace a bucket list trip to Wimbledon for those who wish to go, but it does create new value for sponsors, and it increases the reach of the brand as well, which leads us on to the third angle, the commercial angle. Every sport, whether you like it or not, is looking at growth. You know, when it comes to capitalism and global expansion and the fact that we measure our societies based on, gross domestic profit and growth, sport in line with that is also looking for growth. But when it comes to market expansion and new revenue streams, a lot of sports are dependent on their stadium seating numbers, ticket scarcity, etc. And this moves beyond that. So rather than having new stadia being constructed or expanded, it can provide the idea for a regionalized model that does support that commercial growth without infrastructure change. There's loads to unpick. This is not a perfect answer. It's the start of a conversation, I guess. And it's not straightforward. Growth in any area tends to embed more emissions and obviously has an impact on resource use as well. But in this world where sport is targeting growth, does this give us food for thought about ways it can happen in a more sustainable way? So the start of a conversation and lots to unpick, but interesting to think about it at this stage. So they were our climate hat trick stories for today. We obviously have the FIFA Men's World Cup 2026 kickoff and environmental roundup. Then we had I Might Be a Mutant Now, sport in polluted waters. And lastly, Wimbledon hits Central Park. We unpicked the environmental, globalization, and commercial angles of that. We look forward to being back with you next week with more news, more insights, and we've got heaps going on. Don't forget to sign up to our weekly newsletter, The Brief, which brings you this and so much more in depth around news stories, insights, opinion, events, jobs, and more. Also, make sure you're following the pod to get it every week, and please do share with friends and colleagues who would benefit from this content as well. We look forward to seeing you next week, and have a great one.